But when you're working a very intense career, like 60 hours a week, you've got no mental bandwidth to take the time to work out, well, if I don't do this, then what else? I couldn't leave until I had something to leave to. But I'm never going to have something obvious to leave to unless I've carved out the mental space to work out what the next step would be.
Hey there. Welcome or welcome back to the Mischief Movement podcast. I'm Zoe, your guide on this journey to shake up the status quo and design a life that truly makes you feel alive. If you've ever felt disconnected, stuck on autopilot, or trapped in a life that feels more like a treadmill than an adventure, you're in the right place. I know that change can feel scary, so let's turn down the fear and crank up the fierce as we transform your life from the inside out. Whether it's solo episodes packed with actionable advice or interviews with some absolute badass human beings who've dared to defy the norm by living life their way, we're here to inspire, activate, empower, and challenge you each week. My mission is simple: to help you reawaken your rebel spirit, break free from mediocrity, and design a life that's anything but dull. You only get one wild life, so what are you planning to do with yours? If you're ready to stop settling, start living boldly, and create a positive impact along the way, let's dive in and stir up some mischief together. Now buckle up and let's go. Hello. In this episode of the Mischief Movement podcast, we're diving into the world of Jo Hodson, a quietly unconventional creative designer, ADHDer, and coach who thrives on doing life and business differently. Jo's journey is a masterclass in resilience and reinvention, from her days as an architect to launching a plant-based recipe blog, becoming a certified health coach, and even self-building her own camper van to live nomadically across the UK and Europe. She's all about helping wellness-based entrepreneurs embrace their multiple passions and create a life on their own terms. Seriously, I don't think there could have been more synergy if we'd have tried. Anyway, if you're ready to rebel against the ordinary, let's jump in. Cool. So this week, I'm joined by Jo Hodson, and I am very interested to find out what your mischief is. So would you like to share what your mischief is?
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I've been following you for a while and there's so much synergy. So yeah, I'm really excited. So I suppose you could sum me up as I'm a nomad. I'm also a late diagnosed ADHDer, which brings all its own mischief. I have a business called Create Wellbeing, and I blend my creative work with travel on the road in my self-converted camper van. And I'm kind of going against society's expectations, living out my 40s on my own terms. And I'm also a massive introvert. So I think the phrase quietly unconventional is something that sums me up quite well.
I can totally identify with that, as you probably know. So where do we start? That's really interesting. I'm particularly keen to hear how you ended up building your own camper van and then living in it.
Yeah. Okay. Should we start there?
Yeah.
It was, as with many people, it was a lockdown project.
Okay.
But that said, it had been in the back of my mind for many years prior to that. So I guess backtracking further than that, I had a career in architecture for nearly a decade. So that was my kind of original thing. And then I left that life in early 2013. So it's probably around about then that's the tiny home thing and just doing things differently. And I've always had that alternative spin, even though I didn't know I was neurodivergent at that point. But I think one of the reasons I didn't do it earlier was because, number one, as silly as it sounds, I don't really enjoy driving. So why pick a life that inherently does? And also, I was worried about being lonely. So the first one, I thought, you know what, even if I'm not the sort of person that really enjoys driving, that doesn't mean that I won't enjoy going to cool places. Yes. And secondly, the loneliness is a thing. I mean, we may or may not get onto that later. But again, it's not something that's going to stop me, because you can be lonely wherever you live or however you live. It's about creating community, whatever your lifestyle looks like. So there's that. And that is probably one of my current challenges is figuring out community, particularly as an introvert and an ADHDer. So coming back to the current day, lockdown hit. And I think for many of us, it created the opportunity to pause.
Yes.
And all of our kind of routines and all the things we did on autopilot ground to a halt. And that little creeping idea in the back of my mind came back to sort of the forefront again. And also around that time, my mum had already moved away from the hometown I grew up, and my dad was in the process of moving away. And most of my work was already online at that point. So I came to the realization that I didn't need to be in one place, and there was no one place that I wanted to be. So it was almost like the obvious answer. And I had the time and space to build something. Obviously, I mentioned my career in architecture, and I can visualize things in huge detail and kind of build them. My dad's very handy, and I think I'd absorbed a lot of that by osmosis through most of my life, just the DIY side of things. And he did help. It wasn't like totally me on my own. When did I finish? I started October 2020, and then I finished by the following summer. So over 3.5 years now, I've been on the road.
Wow.
There's the story. And I didn't really know what my expectation was. I think at the time, I thought, what's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is I build the van. I don't get on with it. Van life doesn't suit me. I just sell it again. And at that point, they were going like hotcakes. I would have been able to sell it very easily. Yeah. So it was almost like a no-brainer. There was no real risk in a way. And I liked the idea of the project. It was much more challenging than I imagined it would be to build it out. But I was so proud when I actually finished it. And then I thought, okay, well, I'll just do, all 4 seasons in the van and see what happens at the end of a year. And then it's just continued on in its own rhythm.
Is that what you had in mind then? Was it like I'll give myself a year? Or did you not have any kind of expectations?
I didn't really have any expectation, but I think I liked the idea of, once I'd started, giving myself at least a year, because it did take me a long time to adjust and really find that rhythm on the road. And I thought, if I try it and I don't know, give up too early, I won't have given myself the opportunity to really find that flow. And it probably took me the best part of that year to really find that flow. So I'm really glad that I didn't, because I had some tricky things early on that made it very challenging, but I didn't really have a backup plan. And sometimes when you don't have a backup plan, it actually makes you persevere with the initial plan, because you've got no
What were those things? What were the challenges that you had?
So a few weeks after I finished building the van and I sort of taken off my first little road trip, I went to visit some friends near my old hometown, and I'd parked up somewhere that I thought was safe. And there's various apps you can use, like Park for Night, for example, is one of them. And it's like a user-generated app that shows places that people have parked up, and it gives photos and reviews and things. And this place had good reviews. There were no signs that said no overnight parking or anything like that. And it was close to an area I knew quite well, but I'd never stayed in this area overnight. Anyway, in the middle of the night, I had my windscreen smashed in by a bunch of lads. So that was obviously really terrifying, and that gave me a lot of anxiety off the back of that. Even now, I very rarely wild camp. I tend to use little campsites or pub stops and things like that, and I do a lot of house sitting now for people's pets. And so there's, all of those things have factored into finding my rhythm. But I was only about 3 weeks into van life when that happened. So obviously, it was one of my earliest experiences, which in and of itself probably made a bigger impact compared to that happening, say, 2 years in, when I'd had so much good experience. And then I had a huge mechanical issue where, long story short, I had to replace the entire engine and lots of associated parts. And I ended up spending over $7,000 fixing the van, which was more than I'd bought the van for in the first place. But obviously by that point, I'd built it all out, and it was what, all my time and energy and all the extra money had gone into it.
Yeah.
So those things happened within that first 6 months. And I'm so proud of the fact that I just thought, I'm just going to push through this, because I've overcome the one thing, and then I overcame the kind of the huge financial thing, and then touch wood, but luckily ever since sort of the January 22, everything's been so different. Those first 6 months was hugely rocky. It was almost like it was a test to see if I was really good.
I was thinking that in my head. I'm like, the universe was just testing you.
Exactly. So that's what it felt like. And it's just been, it's still had its own challenges in terms of finding community and all those sorts of things. But there's nothing like those first few months.
Yeah. It's interesting because you were so intentional about what you were doing and you made it work.
Yeah.
What was the catalyst behind it all? Because I know you said that you were in architecture before, and you said that you already had work when you decided to get the van. So how did it come about?
Yeah, I think it was purely because when I was thinking to myself, okay, where do I want to base myself? Because prior to lockdown, I had started traveling more and I'd done quite a few workaways, if you're familiar with that, and just sort of volunteering things. And I'd done a few house sits. And so I'd already started to build up a little bit of momentum around being a little bit more fluid in terms of where I'd base myself.
That's good. So you were sort of experimenting a little
I was
bit, dipping your toe
experimenting with
in.
it. And I was experimenting with, I don't know if I was experimenting with being a full-time nomad, but I just had no desire to be in one place, to be like settled and anchored in one place. That just didn't appeal to me. And then,
is that what you'd been before?
Yeah, pretty much. I'd been in sort of relationships that hadn't really quite worked out. I'd spent bits of time living at my dad's. That had probably meant the most recent thing prior to lockdown. And then I spent most of lockdown at his, and I was like, right, let's just build the van. And so I probably hadn't really been in a financial position to sort of buy a place of my own. But to be honest, I'd never had the desire to buy a sort of a standard house. Like, I'd love to build a tiny home one day, but that's a very different energy to just buying a house in an estate somewhere. I just didn't feel it. I never felt it. And I thought, do I want to get a room with a friend? And none of those things really appealed to me. And I kept trying to make myself do the normal things and feel some sense of desire for that direction, but none of it did. And because I didn't, I don't have, at the time, I didn't have a partner, I don't have kids, I don't have anything that's tying me to one place at all. So it just seemed crazy to do that just because that's what you do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think if I hadn't built the van, I would have potentially looked into things like maybe going to spend some time living in a community, or I don't know what the other options would have been.
Yeah.
But there would have been some sense of fluidity around where I was choosing to base myself.
Yeah. So in amongst all of that, was there also a desire to try a new career, or was that something that just happened because the one that you had didn't fit this kind of lifestyle? How did it all sort of come about then?
So I guess the bigger picture to that is when I left my architecture career in 2013, so that's over 10 years ago now. Part of the trigger for that was because I'd recently, in the year before, I'd gone plant-based, I'd started blogging, I got really into all the health and wellness. I'd always been into like health and fitness, but then the kind of the wellness thing took over, and I just began to sort of question so many aspects of my life.
Yeah.
And so blogging and food and recipe development and photography, that all really took off. And then over time, that kind of morphed into, well, I'd always done all my own design work. I guess a lot of that's from my architecture background and always using the Adobe packages and stuff. But then before I knew it, a lot of friends and other kind of peers, and they were asking me, well, who does your website? Who does all your graphics? And I was like, well, it's me. So then in around about 2016, 17, I sort of formalized that as a design offering. And then that sort of took over then as a sort of design and sort of business strategy, and help people pull things together primarily for wellness-based businesses.
Yeah.
So that was really what I was doing. In amongst all of that, I had a food business as well. So there's lots of different things. Classic ADHD here with lots of different threads, and they all had a common energy, but there was just lots of different things I was doing. So the food business was parked ultimately. That was the only thing I let go of, because that was a physical product, and it required, at the time I was making it, and I didn't want to be tied to a location. So I then just continued with the design type stuff. I use that loosely because I find that there are coaching elements that come into that to tease out kind of the real depth of what the person in the business. I think sometimes people don't show all of who they are to be able to connect to the people they connect with. And that's been my own journey as well. And so I find that naturally comes through when I'm working with people. I'm not just sort of a purist graphic designer by any stretch. But that was what I then spent some time doing. I was doing a little bit of consulting for other brands as well on the side, just to kind of give me some consistency, particularly when I started out and took to the road initially. But yeah, that's sort of how all that over time just kind of morphed and found its own flow. There wasn't any huge pivot. There was always a sort of relationship along the way.
Yeah.
And just I guess the nature of how I worked evolved, and the sorts of projects I would do. And for example, now I'll do things like a design day or a really intense short time frame burst of work rather than.
That sounds fun. What does a design day look like?
Oh, it's so much fun. And again, that really works for my brain. I was diagnosed with ADHD at the beginning of 2020. So again, that was like my lockdown, like, oh, what's going on here? A lot of realization there. And over the last few years, one of the things I have been working a lot harder on is really sitting with how I want to deliver my services. Because even if a client brings a product to me that I'm really interested in, if that client relationship drifts for a number of months, I will lose interest, even if the thing is really exciting to me. I know I work best when I can be like hyper focused. It's sharp, like attention, boom. I can like work a really long day, like bring everything together in a really short time frame. And so that's basically what I do in a design day, whether it's various different elements of graphics or flyers or PDFs, or it might be like a one-page website. It from morning till like the evening, it's kind of hyper focused and contained. There'll be kind of prep work in the lead up to it, and there'll be like a follow-up day where we might tie up loose ends. But the kind of the bulk of the work, of the design work or whatever it is, will be contained within a sort of a 10-hour window. And it also works just with my lifestyle. If I can't always guarantee when I'm traveling how good my Wi-Fi will be, but I can always make sure I can be in an area for one day to like maximize that. And then
that's a really good point.
It just works so much better for me when I can have these intense focus bursts. And I think also it kind of works better both ways, because when there's like back and forth emails constantly, or there's these bits updated, you just, so much momentum is lost in kind of like, oh, where was I again? What was it? Where did we get to? Just that having to remind yourself and get back in the swing of things takes bandwidth. From my point of view, but also from the client's point of view.
You've taken it a step further. It's not just about being intentional in terms of how you're living your life, but also in the way that you're working. Presumably the ADHD diagnosis has had an impact on that, but correct me if I'm wrong.
I think it has. I think for so much of my life I'd been just battling with myself. I'm still a work in progress in terms of quietening my inner critic, because that's very loud and I am a massive overthinker. But I think my self-compassion is definitely something that has got better, because now I don't have that. The inner voice is not so deafening insofar as, well, maybe you're just a rubbish human. I've got like proof that, no, I'm not just a rubbish human. Actually, there's a reason as to why I think and do things in this way. And again, I've been working for myself for over 10 years, but for especially the early years, I was trying to kind of follow all the top business gurus who say you should just focus on one thing and work in a certain way, or take on a client for 12 months because that's like the best way of, like, if you have 10 clients for 12 months, it's much easier than having a client for 3 months and you've got to keep. It made sense like on paper, but it never sat right with me. And so I was in this constant battle of trying to fit the way I'd been told to do things, both throughout my childhood and like education years, but also then how I was engaging with the business world. And this was before I'd found communities of ADHD thinkers and the people who showed that it was okay to do things differently. So that has been a big exploration these last few years, and giving myself that permission. So much of it is just self-permission.
In case you haven't heard, you can now purchase Mischief Movement merch. It's all done through Tmall a UK print-on-demand platform offering global delivery, organic cotton, and production powered by renewable energy. Not only can you now tell everyone you are a true mischief maker, but if you feel inspired to create your own t-shirts, stickers, or mugs, you could also give T-Mail a try, because it's a great way to experiment your ideas and take fast action with low risk. You'll find the links in the show notes, so write yourself a little reminder for later, and let's get back to the episode. In terms of your sort of quiet unconventionality, how else does that manifest itself? Because it's really interesting that you're on the road, you're also doing some dog sitting, you are doing design work. Are there lots of different strands to your life at the moment?
Yeah, there are, and do you know, I really enjoy it like that. I don't want to have. It would be easier in some ways to have just one focus, because then in my head I'd have a clear answer when someone says, "Oh, what do you do?" There'd be like a really clear answer. I do this thing. But I've never been like that, and I think it will depend on who I'm talking to as to which part of me I present first. Because if I'm speaking to another pet owner or something, like the pet sitting tends to come out, particularly if it's in an area that I'm interested in potentially sitting. Or more often than not, the sort of the design side of things come out. It might be that I lead with the kind of the van life thing. It really depends on who I'm speaking to as to what part of me leads. I think the quietly unconventional, a lot of that has come from the fact that I've just never been like a really bold, gregarious, wearing cool clothes, kind of visually obvious alternative, particularly in that sort of the wellness field where I spent a number of years around very obviously alternative people. A lot of the time I can easily fly under the radar, and that's a very comfortable place for me to be. So to do things that are very different, particularly, for example, when I first went vegan, which was like 2012, before it was mainstream, I found that very challenging because I didn't like people asking me questions, which was their own fear and their own thinking and their own, it was triggering for people. I just wanted to not just do my own thing without having all these debates and questions. And I found that so hard. And I guess if I was more outwardly and more of a kind of an extrovert, I would have really enjoyed those opportunities to have these conversations and things. But I found being kind of the center of attention, or like kind of sticking my head above the parapet, I found that really hard. And it's something I've had to get used to, because my natural way of being is to do things differently in terms of how my brain's wired. But my extrovert tendency is just want to hide and not be obvious at all. So figuring out a way of like amalgamating those two things in ways that don't overwhelm me. I think with van life, it's always that little space to come back to. So if I have had days that are overwhelming for whatever reason, I've got my little cozy nest that I can always retreat to. And I think that's another reason why there are so many neurodivergent people who live the van life.
Really?
Because, I hadn't realised how many people I'd connected with online have, now that I've got to know them better, are also ADHDers or would consider themselves as such, even if they haven't had a formal diagnosis. And it makes sense because there's that constant novelty. You're in control. You've got the spontaneity element of it. So you've got the kind of shiny and the sort of the stimulation, but equally you've got that consistent safe space to come back to at the end of each day. And you're in control of where you go, how you move. You can kind of have that decompression time, which is also incredibly important. So this lifestyle really works for my mind, body needs in many ways. So
isn't that that's just real life? That's just what's happened, and that's what makes things interesting. It's the intentionality at the end of the day, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's this is who I am. What's going to work for me to allow me to be the best I can be my most authentic self, and feel fulfilled in what I'm doing at the end of the day.
Exactly. It's in the architecture thing's really interesting, because it's only been in more recent years, as I reflected back, I realised what that sort of season of my life was about, because I don't think it was ever my calling. But I think what I was trying to do at that point was kind of find a way to merge the academic side of me, because I did very well at school academically, but I was always a creative at heart. But that's not something that's celebrated in the education system.
No.
My parents were fully supportive of that, so it wasn't something that was being pushed on me to go sort of towards the academic side from home. But the school system was there was so much kind of underlying pressure and an obvious pressure as well to, not waste your good grades and all this stuff. And so I think basically my reason for choosing the architecture route was a way of doing creativity in a way that had status and prestige. And I worked for quite a modern, very interesting architectural practice that had won lots of awards and things. I didn't work in London. I refused because I would struggle with the city. So I worked at a practice that was in a...
That's interesting, isn't it? Because you knew even then.
Yeah. Even though that's where most of the design jobs were, and most of the people on my course were all getting the jobs in London. So there was this real pull, and I lived in Stevenage, which was 20 minutes from King's Cross on the train line. Like I lived in a commuter town at that time, and everything was like sort of pushing me in that direction. But I knew I wouldn't been able to hack it. I couldn't face this idea of commuting to a city. And I don't regret that career. I learned, I got a lot out of it. I learned which parts of the process I enjoyed. I learned a lot about myself. There was a lot of good that was in there, but it was just never my calling. But I think one of the reasons, and I imagine I'm not alone in this, I think one of the reasons I didn't leave sooner than I did, because I was there about 8.5, 9 years, and I probably knew after about 3 years that this wasn't my thing.
Yeah.
But when you're working a very intense career, like 60 hours a week, you've got no mental bandwidth to take the time to work out, well, if I don't do this, then what else? And I think I was kind of waiting. I couldn't leave until I had something to leave to. That was kind of the story that I was running in my head, which, makes sense. But I'm never going to have something obvious to leave to unless I've carved out the mental space to work out what the next step would be. And it took so long to find... in the end, I basically left without a backup plan. And then figured out my way, because I didn't know what else. I didn't know where to leave to. It was just, there were so many opportunities and potential ideas and things I wanted to explore. The blog had started to build momentum. I hadn't monetized it or anything at that point, but it started to build momentum. So I knew there was something there. I remember saying to myself, right, I'll give it 6 months. And if it's not building obvious momentum and it's bringing me some kind of obvious income, even if it's not, hugely income generating at that point, but if by the summer it's not doing something obvious, then I'll have to go and get a proper job. But luckily by the summer there was enough momentum and enough clarity of direction, and that I just kept going with it.
That's such a good point, because you're absolutely right. It's very easy to think, well, you should just know what you want to go into. You don't want this thing.
Yeah.
So you should just be able to know what you do want. And it's not that
Especially,
easy.
yeah.
And like you say, you need that time. You need to have time to sit down and think about it, or try a few things and give yourself that space. But when you're working so hard, I mean, I can draw parallels with being a parent, or just stepping into, motherhood or fatherhood, where you just have a baby and you think, I don't have the bandwidth, like I can't think. It's just get through the day. Maybe I'll have a chance tomorrow. No, get through that day. Maybe I'll have a chance the next. And months go by, years go by in people's lives, where finding that time can be a real challenge. And, at the end of the day, you did the only thing you could possibly do at that point, presumably, is just, okay, enough. Can't find the time. Yeah. It's just quit.
I think what happened in the end, and this is probably quite another interesting point, is that it got to the point where it was coming up to the November of that year, and I had to give like a month's notice. And I remember just thinking to myself, if I'm still here in January, I'm going to be here another year and another year and another year. And I was coming up towards my 30th birthday. It might have been the year I was like 29, but I think if I'd been there another year, I would have then been 30. And just suddenly that was enough. That fear, that, oh my gosh, I'll be here another year. And basically my life is just coasting along in neutral. The fear of staying suddenly became bigger than the fear of leaving. And it was so incremental, but until the balance tips. And that was the moment when I realized if I didn't leave now, then when will I leave? And like, I can even feel goosebumps as I'm saying it, but I just remember that like real visceral feeling of, wow, if I don't leave now, there's never going to be a perfect time. But if there is such a thing as a perfect time, this is probably it.
It's about as close as you're going to get. It's everybody's tipping point is different, isn't it?
Yeah. And that was definitely mine. Yeah. That sort of all those different factors that had filtered into my thought process in that moment of November 2012. And it was just such a subtle shift, but it was enough to just tip the balance.
Yeah. And how's life looking now then? What's on the horizon? What are you dreaming about for the next 5 or 10 years? Or are you very much just see where the van life takes you?
I would love to build a tiny home because touching one of the things I mentioned at the beginning was one of the challenges, again, being an introvert doesn't help, is when you're constantly moving, it is hard to build community and maintain relationships. I do sometimes struggle with that sort of object permanence thing, is that, when people and things aren't in front of me, they can feel very abstract. And so I would like to create sort of just the experience of community again and have a regular gym classes to go to and those sorts of things. They're the things I really miss. It's tiny things like, use an example of a gym class, like walking into a room of a class that you've been to numerous times before, even if it's just been for a few months, and people looking up and recognizing you, and just that slight nod of recognition, rather than just being this invisible human that's gone to a gym just as a one-off class as I'm passing through. That is so significant. And I really miss those things. I think also because I'm the one doing the traveling, and most of the people I come across are the ones kind of stationary. It's always down to me to initiate the conversations or the connections. And it's something I find really hard. I find initiation hard. And so it's a lot on me to, if I want not to feel lonely, I need to initiate the connections. And that can become quite heavy. So one of the things I would love to do in the next 5 years would be to build a tiny house somewhere that I can then use it as a holiday let, so that I can basically live there up to, I think it's about 24 weeks of the year. You can technically live somewhere if it's a holiday let. So I'd have like a semi base, and then when it's being let out, I'd travel. I'd love to build, the like Canopy and Stars type, that kind of thing. I'd love to build an on-off grid tiny home that's sort of using all the principles I built into the van in a slightly larger way. For me, but also then to let out. So then I'm kind of almost being paid to travel, because I just travel when it's being let out. And I feel like that feels like,
and a space like that would have so much potential for all kinds of fun things.
I can feel the creativity. I can feel kind of the wellnessy stuff. I could feel things like I could have more in-person sort of coaching or workshop type. There'd be lots of things that I could see that would allow the space for, like, physically, but also just like energetically, things that I can't do when I'm constantly in motion. So that is definitely something I can feel. It feels very tangible. It's just a case of, it's the land and things like that, which we know will happen, but that's kind of where the cost and whatever it is. But so that is definitely something that's on my agenda. But between now and then, I think van life suits me well. That combined with house sits. So I kind of do a hybrid of looking after people's pets and basically in between travels in the van. And other than the sort of the focus on more intentionally creating community, which is not impossible as you're traveling, it's just harder. So that is a focus for me, because I think that would be the kind of the first way I would feel burnt out by van life, would be if I was not gaining kind of traction on creating community and a sense of belonging. Sometimes I can go weeks without speaking to other people, and you get stuck in your own little overthinky head, and it's not always a great place when you get to that point. So van life is still working well. My van is still, I'd love to build another van as well in the meantime, but because I have so many ideas I want to do. There's only so many things you can fit into a van, and there's only, you have to kind of pick one layout, and there's other layouts and things I want to explore. So I build another van at some point, but then ultimately build a tiny home, maybe a couple of them.
Okay, just before we wrap up, I would like to ask you, is there a message that you would like to leave the listeners with? Is there something about your story that perhaps you wish you'd known, that somebody had told you or warned you about, or something that you feel like you could advise people listening?
I find myself sort of going back to my school days and that sense of, being an introvert, being someone who was a people pleaser, didn't want to disappoint other people, didn't want to disappoint my teachers. I didn't trust my own intuition. I didn't have that inner self-validation for a long, long time. And I think one of the biggest things I wish I'd, focused on nurturing within myself is that it's okay to disappoint people. It's okay to go your own path and go against expectations. Because I didn't believe that for so long. And the quietly unconventional side of me, still struggles from time to time, still doesn't necessarily trust that this is the right way forward, or that I'll be shot down, or it won't work. And people say, "Look, told you so." But none of that matters, because experimentation is part of the process. Like, you need to fail in order to learn and to grow and to evolve. And so just trusting that little voice, even if you can't articulate what it is you want to do, trust the feeling, because sometimes an inner feeling will come through before there's any words to put to it. So you won't necessarily be able to articulate to someone else the path you're pursuing, but you just have that inner knowing, and that is enough. That inner knowing is enough. It doesn't have to have language at that point, and that will come in time. And other people may understand, and they may never understand. But either way, the inner knowing is your North Star.
Oh, and I'm nodding away because I just feel what you're saying so deeply.
I don't think I've ever really thought about that before. I think it's because I was just sort of thinking back to my school days and just not acknowledging it was even there.
Yes. It's funny when you talked about, the whole quietly unconventional thing is something that I've become very aware of recently. You look back and you think, actually, there was always that unconventional streak in me, despite the fact that I didn't want to stand out. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. And as you said, I was nodding away when you were talking about sort of creating that balance. It's really hard because part of you doesn't want to follow the herd and wants to do your own thing, but not at the expense of your inner peace. You're not craving attention. It's just that the unconventional path feels more aligned to you. And isn't it? It's hard.
I remember saying to a business coach years ago, I wish I could just be okay with settling. I wish I could just have a normal job and be okay with that. I was so frustrated that I couldn't. But there we are.
So where can people find out more about you?
My favourite place to hang out is Instagram. So on Instagram, I am Jo Hodson, and I share my life on the road, my house sits, my work. And I get quite raw and vulnerable on there, because one of the ways that I think to process, I speak to process things. And so I share a lot of my stories. My website is createwellbeinglimited.com. So both of those places you can find out more about my work, but also just get a feel for who I am day to day.
Brilliant. Jo, thank you so much.
I'm so happy to have this conversation. It's been a lot of fun.
So before we go, here are my takeaways from Jo's episode. Number 1, be on the lookout for opportunities and remember that they may come disguised as a complete disaster. Getting laid off, splitting from a partner, moving to a place, to even a global pandemic are all difficult circumstances to navigate on the surface, but often we can flip the script and turn them into something positive. 2, give yourself a fighting chance. If you've mustered the courage to try something new and scary, set yourself a time goal so you don't throw in the towel at the first hurdle. 3, sometimes having no plan B is the best thing to help propel you forward, even when it feels uncomfortable. 4, if you have an idea about what you'd like to do in the future, see if you can start experimenting in small ways in the present. Jo was able to test her dream of leading a more nomadic lifestyle by taking on small projects like workaways, volunteering and house sitting before she committed to her plan to buy a van. 5, part of designing your life intentionally is knowing how you work best, which might not conform to the standard 9 to 5 or even hybrid office format. So don't be afraid to experiment with new ways of working that allow your day to flow, your energy to remain high, and your focus to last. 6, give yourself permission to not fit in. Somebody's blueprint to running a business, starting a hobby, making money, or setting goals is them selling you whatever worked for them. Get used to the idea that you will probably find more joy and fulfillment from tuning in to who you are and knowing how you function as a human. 7, the question, what do you do, can be really uncomfortable, especially when you have many skills, different experiences, and multiple income streams. But you can always adapt your reply to your circumstances and even craft different responses depending on who you're talking to. 8, so often we stay too long in situations we know aren't right for us because we're too busy to figure out where to go next. But unless we make time to reflect and create mental space to help those creative solutions flow, we won't be able to get off the treadmill and pursue what we really want. 9, everyone has a tipping point where the fear of staying the same finally begins to outweigh the fear of making a change. So what's yours? And number 10, don't let other people's expectations hold you back from trying things, failing and trying again, because experimentation is part of the process. That's a wrap on another episode of the Mischief Movement podcast. If today's content stirred something in you, let's keep in touch on Instagram or connect with me on LinkedIn. You can even click the link in the show notes to sign up to my Mischief Mail newsletter, where you'll get exclusive insights on upcoming episodes and your chance to submit questions to future guests. But shh, don't tell anyone, it's our secret. For more info on ways to work with me and some fun free resources, check out the website themischiefmovement.com. Until next time, stay bold, stay rebellious, and of course, keep making mischief.